Welcome to our very last lab lecture on the nervous system. I have purposely slimmed it down quite a bit as it's the last lecture and I know it's the end of the semester. So in that sense, I definitely don't want it to be overwhelming because it can be very overwhelming. So let's go ahead and begin. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and I'm just going to put it on presentation mode. If it lets me. Yes, it does. Okay, so first I want to begin with the function. Okay, as this is our last lab, it's pretty much going to be all anatomy based. There might be a few definitions, but not nearly as much as in a lecture. Okay, so the nervous system, and if you recall, has a few specific functions. Okay, one of them is going to be sensory input. And sensory input basically is gathering information to monitor changes occurring inside and outside of the body. These changes are known as stimuli. Okay, then another function that it does is integration. It integrates. So integration refers to the process of interpreting sensory input and deciding whether or not action is needed. Okay, and then the third function is what we call motor output. Okay, which is basically a response to the integrated stimuli, and this response normally activates either muscles or glands, and that's pretty much your basic function. Okay, all of this happens very, very quickly. Okay, these neurosynapses are milliseconds, and you'll learn more about that specifically in a lecture if you haven't already done so. Okay, so now let me just talk about how the nervous system is categorized or subdivided is probably better. Okay, so you have the central nervous system, which is one aspect. You have the peripheral nervous system, and both of them, as we just saw in our functions, rely on receptors. Okay, so the receptors can either be sensory, okay, well, I wanted to say sensory, but let's go back. They're called somatic sensory receptors. Okay, and they're going to monitor the outside, the external environment and our position in it. Whereas the other type of sensory, okay, is visceral sensory receptors. And they're going to monitor the inside, the internal conditions, and the status of other systems. So remember, all of this really works together to maintain homeostasis. Okay, now, so these are the sensory receptors, okay, and the sensory receptors, okay, both somatic and visceral, are going to bring information in, and we call this aspect of bringing information into the central nervous system, so it would be from peripheral to central, okay, we call it the afferent division. Okay, so if there's an afferent division, there's going to be another type of division afterwards. Okay, so sensory information, okay, one of the subcategories or subdivisions is afferent division. Okay, and then, of course, the information stimuli is basically, I want to say, not processed, but channeled, okay, into the central nervous system. And in the central nervous system, okay, it's going to be integrated, okay, and integration can occur, okay, either by the spinal cord, by the brain, or by both, okay. Now, the opposite, as I said before, if we go back to our functions, okay, is what the action after the information has been processed to decide whether or not an action is necessary, okay, the command would go through the efferent division. So A for sensory and E for motor. Okay, the efferent division is the motor division. So it is going to basically, it's basically going to command an action of some sort. Okay, now the efferent division can be subdivided into two other categories, okay, or two other systems. And those are the somatic nervous system. Okay, don't get it confused with the somatic sensory receptors. Okay, we're talking about the motor command, that efferent division. Okay, one of its subdivisions is the somatic nervous system. The other is the autonomic nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system basically commands effectors, and these effectors are specifically skeletal muscle. Okay, now the other one that I mentioned, the other subdivision of the efferent division, okay, is the autonomic, which is pretty easy. No, autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means self-regulating, self-controlling. Okay, so you do not command it. Remember, skeletal muscle is voluntary. Okay, so you could stop it. You could stop the action. Okay, however, with the autonomic nervous system, you cannot. Okay, now the autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into two more divisions, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division. Okay, and both of them, okay, will trigger, okay, action from either smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Okay, now there are two nicknames given to these subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, we said parasympathetic division tends to control or regulate, okay, those organs, okay, that deal with rest and digest. Okay, so you've got digestion, you've got urinary, defecation, diuresis, okay, and of course the cardiovascular, just to name a few. Okay, but you need to know that parasympathetic division deals with rest and digest. Okay, whereas the sympathetic division is going to deal with fright and flight. So these are modes of action. Okay, and these are a split second, maybe even a split millisecond, okay, of the decision that comes to play, okay, to carry out these actions. Anyways, I didn't mean to go rambling on, but I definitely wanted you to know the breakdown. And I have this in lecture. For those of you not in my lecture, if you want the table, I will give you the table. Okay, but it is important. So let's look at our nervous system. The central nervous system, as I've already mentioned before, is divided by the brain as an organ and the spinal cord. Okay, so let's look at the brain. Okay, now the brain, the brain basically, okay, has four main parts to it. Okay, but the whole brain and the spinal cord, first of all, have to be protected. Okay, and you already know that the spinal cord is protected by the bone around it, and then the muscles around it. Okay, but closer to the spinal cord and around the brain, you have several sheets of connective tissue. Okay, that protect, okay, the spinal cord and the brain. Okay, they are called the meninges. So the meninge layers. And I'll repeat myself later on when you see a picture, but it is important that you know that there's three layers. Okay, the layer that sits most on top of the brain or the spinal cord, so closest to it, okay, touching the tissue, the neurons, okay, is the pia matter. Okay, the pia means delicate. Okay, it is a very thin tissue. You cannot peel it off. It's very delicate. Okay, so it's the innermost and it's highly vascular, so lots of blood supply, okay, and covers the brain and spinal cord. The next layer that you have, the one on top of the pia mater, okay, is the arachnoid matter. Now, matter refers to, in Latin, as mother. And so pia was delicate mother. And then the arachnoid mother is spidery-like, just like arachnoid. An arachnoid is a spider. So there are what looks like strings, and they're not, they're just capillaries, okay, and that web out, okay, to say on this layer, on this connective tissue layer, okay, and it is what we say the middle layer, and it has these little fibers that branch out like that. And then the last layer, the outermost layer, so this is the layer that sits up against the skull on the inside, okay, or the vertebra on the inside of the spinal cord, okay, or around the spinal cord. And that's called the dura mater. And the dura mater is the outermost layer, and it is very tough. It's a very tough fibrous connective tissue, okay, and I'm just thinking, okay, we're not going to do a dissection, and I'm not going to give you a dissection to watch because, as I said, the time frame. But you do need to know the 3 layers and the purpose of the meninges. That's what these are called, the meninges. Okay, and we'll probably see another picture later on. Okay, so the next one, this is where we're going to talk a little bit about our brain. Okay. Okay, so the brain has 4 main parts. Okay, one of them you don't see very well here, but I'll point it out. Okay, so the outermost layer, the largest layer, okay, in volume, okay, is the cerebrum. Okay, the layer that sits inside this pink area, okay, so below the corpus callosum, which we'll talk about in a second, okay, is the dicephalon. Followed by, okay, then you have the midbrain. And followed by that is the spinal cord. Okay, now on the back side of the brain, okay, you have the cerebellum. The cerebellum looks like cauliflower. But you need to look at this and you need to know which part is the anterior part, which part is the superior part, which part is the posterior part, because you're going to have to know when you see these pictures what side you're looking at, or what part what that part direction you're looking at it. Okay, so always know that the cerebellum will always face the posterior side. So as you can see here, you're seeing this is mid-sagittal, or I should say sagittal, okay, because you're cutting it right down the center, which is separating a right side from a left side. Okay, here we only see the side, so we see a lateral view, okay, but that's what we have. So those are the 4 parts of the brain. You need to know them, and you also need to be able to label them. But on top of that, you need to know the parts that make up those 4 parts of the brain, okay, or 4 regions of the brain. I think in lecture I talk about it as 4 regions of the brain, okay. So let's continue with a little bit of this. So the cerebral cortex, as I said, is the outermost layer, okay, and here we have, this is the outermost layer, okay. It is highly convoluted, which we'll get into. Its purpose in being highly convoluted is to increase surface area. And you probably have seen this enough to understand that anytime you have ridges and bumps and a continuous up and down, the whole point of it being that way is to increase surface area. So for whatever function the organism, okay, organ would have, okay, or even cell would have. Now, generally, the brain is studied, as I said, okay, in the based on those 4 regions. Now, the cerebrum is also divided into 2 halves. okay? I'll probably come back to this one in a second. Let me show you the two halves. So here are the two halves. So all of this is together is the same color. It's not color coded in real life, okay? But you do have your cerebral hemispheres. That is what it's called, okay? You have a right hemisphere, okay, that dictates more of the sensory stimulus from the left side of the body. It crisscrosses, okay? Motor control of the left side. It is in charge of creativity and spatial ability. Also perception. Perception refers to knowing where you are in space and time. So knowing that your arm is facing forward, okay, in front of you, or knowing that it's on the side. And so if you close your eyes, you should be able to know, okay, where your limb is, okay? And so it's your perception of position, body position, and also recognition of faces, okay, places and objects. So it has some memory aspect here. Being able to, basically, it's being able to put two and two together, linking up a face that's familiar, okay, and then bringing it to the surface. Now, the left side, okay, also has sensory stimuli from the right side of the body, again, crisscrosses, also has or deals with motor control on the right side of the body. Speech and language and comprehension are aspects of the left side, okay? Analysis and calculations, again, of the left side. Time and sequencing, left side, and recognition of words, letters, and numbers. Okay, so yes, you will have to know that because I will have this on the test, either matching or maybe just a multiple choice and asking you which side does this characteristic belong to. Okay, do I want to say anything else on that? No, go back through. So again, here's a better picture. So here you have again your cerebrum, your dicephalon, which is the sort of the inner core, okay, center. Think of it as bullseye in a three-dimensional circle, sphere, okay. And then you have the midbrain, which is also called, the brain stem, okay, and then the cerebellum. Okay, so those are your four regions. Now, one thing, oops, sorry about that. One thing that I did not mention is the anatomy of how the cerebrum is formed. Well, no, not formed, but parts of the cerebrum. I've already talked about the hemispheres. That's a big one. So I want to talk a little bit about how the tissue is divided. Okay, and for that, I'm going to show this picture. So this is a transverse section. I'm just thinking, and transverse, it could be either or, it could be frontal, because the cerebrum is all of this all the way to the back, well, up to about here. Okay, it could be a transverse or a frontal plane or even a sagittal plane. So it could be any one of the planes, but because it's just so big. But anyways, okay, so we have two main parts, okay, of what we see on the surface of the cerebrum. We have these rises, they look like hills, and they're called gyrus. Gyri for plural, gyrus for singular. So here's one gyrus. Okay, now it dips in before you get to the next gyrus. Okay, and this dip right here, okay, actually goes in a little bit further into the tissue. And these dips, or valleys, if you want to remember it that way, are called sulcus. And yes, you need to know it. So in plural, it would be sulci. Okay, now the outermost portion of the cerebrum is all cortex, just like bark of a tree. Okay, that's what it is, the bark of the tree, but this is the bark of the cerebrum. It's called cortex. And the cortex is made up of only okay, gray matter. Okay, we'll get to gray matter in a second. And if you remember from lecture, okay, gray matter is unmyelinated neurons, okay? Now, what's underneath the cortex, okay, which is the actual cerebrum per se, is white matter. And white matter is still neurons, but these neurons are myelinated. And myelin basically produces a white, shiny appearance, which is why it's called white matter, okay? Now, on this little picture here, it's just showing you that you have a very large indentation inside, crevice that goes inside, and the big ones are called fissures, okay? And the only one you need to worry about is the one that we just talked about, okay? This right here, separating the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere, is the longitudinal fissure, okay? Longitudinal fissure, which makes sense because it just cuts you right in half, okay? You can't see it on here. You can't see it on here because we're looking at it lateral, and you can't see it on here because it's cut down all the way. So this is the best picture to identify the longitudinal fissure. Okay, so where are we here? Cerebral cortex, talked about it, gyrus, sulcus, okay. Again, the purpose of having a lot of them is increased surface area. The more surface area, the more you're going to be able to do higher function. Okay. Okay. Now, we'll probably have to come back to that. Okay, the corpus callosum, CC. Okay, that's the nickname I give it. Look at it right here. Here it is. Okay. Now, when you look from above, okay, from the superior aspect of the cerebrum, and you're looking at the two hemispheres, okay, you saw that there's a longitudinal fissure. Well, the longitudinal fissure doesn't go all the way through. It actually stops, okay, the groove actually stops right here, okay, and this is a collection, okay, of white neurons. It's more like, I want to say, you could say a tract or a highway, okay? A tract and highway, okay, or even freeway if you want it that way. So why would you need a freeway? Well, many of the responses or actions generated by the cerebrum, okay, have to be coordinated with responses from both sides of, okay, the cerebrum. So from the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And so the corpus callosum is the largest band of neurons that connect, okay, directly the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. So this enables the brain, the two hemispheres, to be continuously talking to one another. And that is really what it's doing at immense velocities, very, very, very quickly. I wanted to see if I had anything in my notes to talk about this, but I'm not seeing anything. No, just corpus callosum, a large fiber tract connecting the cerebral hemisphere, okay, and it's right above the dicephalon, which, as you can see here, all of this underneath is the dicephalon. This is the midbrain, cerebellum, cerebrum, okay? So yeah, this right here, okay? So it's just important that you understand that they're large fiber tracts and that their purpose is to connect the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere so that they can coordinate, okay, in action, okay? And that is, it's very important. Okay, now further, what do we want? What else do we want to talk about? Okay, the cerebrum is divided into 6 major lobes, okay? And the lobes are named per the bone layer above, okay? So they're above the cranial bone. So that means that you have one frontal lobe on top of the frontal bone. Okay, two parietal lobes, right and left, sorry, left and right, okay, on the parietal bones. Okay, you have two temporal ones, okay, one on the right, on the left, one on the right, and one occipital lobe. So, what else do we have? We have, okay, the lobes, as I said, are named based on the bone that they're above. And then they also have specific functions. I'm going to stop this for 1 second. Pause. My apology, I had the window open and the blower, the gardener with the blower came by and couldn't hear anything. Okay, so I've already talked about the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Okay, so, and as you can see here, I mean, this is a great three-dimensional picture. So you have all the lobes. Here's your frontal lobe, as you will see, is quite large. The parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobes. Okay, so all of them. Now, each one of them is in charge, okay, of specific areas or specific sensory aspects of the brain. Very well, but so for example, the occipital lobe, all sensory stimuli or input from the eyes, okay, will go straight to the occipital lobe. Okay, all sensory input or stimuli from hearing from the ears and taste will go to the temporal lobes. Okay, so that leaves the frontal lobe and the parietal lobes responsible for other sensory information. It could be tactile, general sensory information, and motor, okay, initiation and coordination. So I do not have them in a lab. You do need to know the lobes, but I don't have what you need. You don't have to know what specifically they're in charge for. I didn't put it in. Okay, I'm more concerned that you know the general 4 regions of the brain and their parts. Okay, so next, what do we have? Okay, so we have the dicephalon. So if I go back to the beginning, okay, here's our dicephalon again, our egg, and this is what the egg actually looks like. Okay, so the egg, the dicephalon has 3 parts. Okay, it has the thalamus, which is like 2 eggs together. So you have a right and a left thalamus. On its anterior portion, below, so inferior anterior portion of the thalamus, you see a little nugget, okay, and that is called the hypothalamus. Okay, now if you go to the very back portion of the thalamus, the posterior aspect of the thalamus, okay, you're going to have another nugget, and that is going to be your epithalamus. Okay, and you can't see it very well here. Let me go back and see if I have it in any of the other pictures. No. So you can see here the hypothalamus, the thalamus. So the epithalamus would be right here, but you're not seeing it. Okay, and at least not in this picture. Let's go back. Okay. So, oh, I've got it over here. So now we'll see it better. Okay, so let me just review function. Okay, so the dicephalon, as I said, has 2 egg shapes, the thalamus, right and left. Okay, and together the thalami, okay, basically they serve as a junction and relay station. So what's a relay station? Well, where information is exchanged. So really it's not so much being exchanged as being properly relayed to the right part of the brain. Okay, so information coming from other parts of the brain will go through the thalamus, especially from the peripheral nervous system. So outside of the central nervous system will go to the central nervous system and then will come up, okay? And all that stimuli will go straight through the thalamus and then get rerouted to the proper part of the cerebrum that it needs to go to. Anything else? No. It is also considered the most superior portion of the brainstem. Okay. However, the brainstem we're going to in class we're going to see it as a complete different region. Okay. No. Okay. So the thalamus, large egg-shaped masses of gray and white matter. So you have myelinated and unmyelinated neurons, okay? And those constitute about 80% of the diencephalon. This, specifically the hypothalamus is located, as I said, on the anterior inferior aspect of the diencephalon. Okay, it contains the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. Okay, and it is important in the regulating of the endocrine system, okay, monitoring sleep-wake cycles, controlling thirst, hunger, and body temperature. You need to know that, okay? You're not going to get out of that, and that's very short. I think I go a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more in lecture, okay? But you do need to know it. It is underneath the notes, okay? Specifically what the hypothalamus does. Okay. The epithalamus is also an endocrine organ. It contains an endocrine organ called the pineal gland or pineal body. Okay. And the pineal body secretes the hormone known as melatonin. Okay. And melatonin is important in maintaining, okay, your sleep-wake cycles. Okay, and that is pretty much it. So that is our diencephalon. Remember, so diencephalon is an important, basically, track, okay, for a relay track and junction. Okay, it contains the thalamus, okay, with gray and white matter. Okay, a hypothalamus, important in regulating the endocrine system, monitoring the sleep-wake cycle, controlling thirst, hunger, and body temperature. It also, the hypothalamus also contains, okay, the pituitary gland. Now the epithalamus, which is on the posterior side, contains a pineal body, which secretes melatonin, okay? And I think that's pretty much it. And I have it all here. Let me see. Okay, hypothalamus, yes, regulates body temperature, food intake, and thirst. Okay, pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. Okay, you will see that. You'll see that in your lab manual. So let's look at it. Okay, because I didn't have the pictures of it before. So our cerebrum, our corpus callosum, CC. Okay, the big C. Okay, here's our egg shape. So this is our thalamus. Okay, and then we said that in front of the thalamus, the nugget, okay, that sticks anteriorly and inferiorly, the thalamus, is your hypothalamus. And below the hypothalamus, you have a little pod that sticks out, and that is your pituitary gland. Now there's a little, you could say string, okay, that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. And this little string, which is actually a duct, okay, it's called the infundibulum, infundibulum, and it's in your book, and you're going to see it, okay? And then, of course, you do have on the posterior side of the thalamus, okay, or dicephalon, you have the pineal gland. And there it is, your little nugget that sticks out underneath inferiorly, okay, on the posterior side is your pineal gland. So again, the pineal gland secretes melatonin. And so here you have, okay, a different picture, but you can see quite clearly, okay, that you have your, this is your hypothalamus, okay, your pituitary gland, and this would be your pineal gland, okay, and the dicephalon would be right here. Okay, and that's it for that one. So let's see if it lets me go to the next one. Okay, as I said before, the pineal gland is small, okay, and it basically produces melatonin. Okay, it is an endocrine gland. Okay, so it secretes directly into the bloodstream. Okay, so the pineal gland, endocrine gland, as you can see here, located near the center of the brain. Okay, I'm sorry, the pineal gland, the very center of the brain, between the two hemispheres. It's pine cone shape. Okay, and again, it secretes melatonin. That's your pineal gland. Okay, so here's pituitary and pineal. Make sure you can define them. Pituitary anterior, pineal posterior. Okay, now the next one. Okay, the next one we're going to talk about is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is that cauliflower structure that sits right here underneath. Okay, and it is small. Okay, it's not as big as the cerebrum, but it is very important. It receives information from sensory systems, the spinal cord, other parts of the brain, and it regulates motor movements. Key point: to regulate motor movement is not initiate. Initiation of gross motor movement is done, okay, by the cerebrum, okay, the frontal and parietal lobes. Okay, so that means that the cerebellum's job is pretty much coordination, okay, coordination of those movements. So timing. What else? Do I have anything else about the cerebellum? No, it's cauliflower-like. I told you that. It's only found underneath in the posterior aspect. It does have a cortex area, so it also has gray matter and white matter. Okay, now the white matter branches into the gray matter, and this is what we're seeing right here. So again, you have, okay, a cortex of gray matter, okay, and an inner portion that branches into the gray matter, that's white matter. Now that white matter is called arbovitae, which pretty much means the tree of life. Okay. What else? Do I have anything else? Again, it's convoluted, meaning that it has increased surface area because of the rises and the depressions. Okay. What else do we have? That's pretty much it for now. I'm not going to go into anything else for right now, but there is that. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Okay, so we finished with the dicephalon and the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with the brain stem. So the brain stem follows the dicephalon. It has three parts to it. It has the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Okay, and this is what it looks like right here. The midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Okay, now each one has their own specific functions. The brain stem, I guess I'm just thinking of the midbrain. The midbrain pretty much follows into the pons, and the pons, what the pons has are specialized tracts. They're called peduncles, okay? And they basically relay information from the spinal cord to the dicephalon. But they're very, very important. So that's your pons, and I have more. I'm just, my medulla, well, medulla is the most important aspect of it. It's important autonomic center of the brain. Okay, I don't know, I have more on it, but I guess I did not write it in the bottom, so it's going to be right there. Yeah. Let's see. So basically, the medulla oblongata is responsible for main functions of heart rate, breathing, sleeping, and eating. Okay, now this is the one structure that you've heard your whole life. Be careful you don't hit someone in the back of their head. Okay, because the medulla oblongata basically is right at the base of the cauliflower. So if you did fall, okay, and hit the back of the head at such an angle where the medulla oblongata is exposed, okay, you would kill the person. Okay, this is these can be fatal blows. Anyway, so your heart rate would stop, breathing would stop. Okay, the rest doesn't really matter, but heart rate and breathing are vital. So the key into answering the question properly on the test is that you know that the basic vital functions are controlled by the medulla oblongata. And important functions, let me go back, okay, important functions are controlled, if I have it here, by the hypothalamus. I mean, it has important functions, but they're not vital, okay? Dicephalon regulates the hypothalamus, okay, regulates body temperature, food intake, and thirst, okay? But you could survive with these not being in homeostasis for a certain period of time. Whereas the other one, if you stop breathing, you stop breathing. Okay, you're not going to survive very long. Okay, moving on. Oops. Okay, the brain is surrounded. This is what I had at the end, but I talked about earlier. Anyways, these are your meninges. Okay, as you can see, there's 3 layers. You have your pia mater here, your arachnoid matter, and your dura mater. 3 layers of connective tissue, and each one of them is different. Okay, the pia mater, as you can see, is right over the cortex of the cerebrum, and it's very delicate. It doesn't take anything to tear through it, okay? The arachnoid matter, we said, has fibers going from one side to the other, and that's what it looks like. It actually looks like the San Francisco Bridge. There you go. Okay, so it's spidery because of those fibers, okay? And then the last one is the dura mater, which protects, well, actually surrounds all of the brain and all of the spinal cord. Okay, and it is the layer that sits right up against the inside of the skull or the bone. Okay, and I think that is, yeah, okay, the spinal cord. So that is your brain, okay, and the parts of the brain that you need to know, and they're all here. Okay. Okay, so the spinal cord. You do need to know some anatomy of the spinal cord. So this is a transverse section of the spinal cord. When you do a transverse section of the spinal cord, okay, you're going to see this pattern. It's called the butterfly effect or the bat effect. It's more of a butterfly effect, okay? So what's important on this diagram? You need to figure out which part is the anterior portion of the spinal cord and which part is the posterior portion of the spinal cord. Okay, that is a must, because otherwise you're going to get the horns, the parts all confused. So first, you're going to find 2 characteristics that distinguish or differentiate the anterior portion from the posterior portion. Okay, and as you can imagine here, there is a big crevice. Okay, it's called a fissure. okay? And it's called the anterior medium fissure, okay? So this is, of course, the anterior side. Therefore, the opposite side is going to be the posterior side. And so here you have a posterior medium sulcus. A sulcus is not as deep or big as a fissure, okay? But that is on the posterior side. Now, looking at it from, we'll do from the anterior side. I said that you see two different types of neurons, okay? You see white matter followed by basically gray matter, okay? And white matter again. Remember, white matter is just myelinated neurons. Gray matter is unmyelinated neurons. Now, right in the center, you have a hole. It's a cavity, and it's the central canal, and it's full of fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. So this cerebrospinal fluid actually bathes, okay, the inside and the outside of the spinal column, and also of the brain, okay? Important there. So you need to know everything that is boxed. Now that you know what side is posterior and anterior, you can really look at, okay, the difference in the extensions of the gray matter. Now these extensions are called horns, and they're divided by dorsal and ventral. Dorsal will always be in the back portion, so posterior side of the spinal cord. Ventral, which is the ventral horns, ventral root, will always be in the anterior portion, okay? Now, if you're looking at it on one of the lateral ends, lateral sides, you'll see that you have nerve roots, okay, that basically merge together and enter the spinal cord at, okay, the posterior horn, okay? So you have here these nerves, okay, because they're bundles of neurons. You have here basically you could say a nugget where they converge. Many of them converge, and it's called a ganglion. Okay, so dorsal root ganglion because it's on the dorsal side, okay, and then you have the dorsal root going into the dorsal horn, okay, and here you have, okay, gray matter, as I said, the posterior horn, okay, is the dorsal horn, okay, from the dorsal root. Okay, then you have a smaller horn, which is called the lateral horn, and then you have the anterior horn, okay, which is, of course, facing anterior. Okay, and then, of course, the nerves that extend out, okay, to form the ventral root. And that's that. And let's see what else I have. So here you have a picture for looking at it from above, okay, and it's the same thing, and I can show you it here. Okay, again, white matter, gray matter, central canal. Okay, this is your posterior horn of the gray matter. Okay, right and left. This is your anterior horn. Okay, ventral horn, anterior horn, right and left. Okay, and then of course your roots that extend out from the spinal cord. And here you can see it a little bit better. There's your ganglion, your dorsal root ganglion, and the sensory neuron that's going to come in. Now, that's one thing to note. All sensory information going to the spinal cord goes in through the back. So it goes in through the posterior side. Any action that needs to be taken, okay, will be emitted, okay, through the anterior horn or anterior side. It's the same thing again, dorsal horns projecting back, ventral horns projecting forward, okay? And then, of course, cerebrospinal fluid. So that is it. Now, gray matter, I did not mention that is not just neurons. You do have some neuroglia cells, and you would probably remember from lecture, there's several different types, okay, you have your astrocytes, which is the most common, okay? But anyways, let's go on. I don't think I have anything else. In humans, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. I don't have anything else. So the next one, oh yes, this one is important. So I've already talked about that, okay? So root is done. So now what I want to mention is how this works, okay? It works in coordination. Both the dorsal root and the ventral root work together, okay? And they work together. Now, some actions are purely reflexes, meaning there's no thought involved. It's just an automatic response. Okay, and when that's the case, we call those responses a reflex arc. So what does that mean? It just means that, okay, receptors to a stimulus occur and the information gets sent down, okay, this is, oh, there you go, down the sensory neuron, okay, it will get preliminarily processed at the dorsal root ganglion, okay, but then it will go into the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now, this area right here, okay, between the afferent neuron and the efferent neuron is called the interneuron. So this is where integration actually occurs. And so the decision, okay, whether or not an action needs to take place or not, is going to just happen in here. Like I said, it's less than a millisecond. Okay, now if action does need to take place, okay, the motor neuron will conduct the action or will send the action through the efferent nerve, okay, to whatever is the center, the effector organ. So in this case, if we're looking at it here, okay, it's telling the bicep to contract so you can move your hand from whatever sensory, think of it as a hot plane, whatever sensory stimuli trigger that reflex act, okay? So reflexes, just a bit on it. Reflexes are rapid, they're predictable, involuntary motor responses to stimuli, okay? And they occur over pathways, as I said before, that are called reflex arcs. So reflexes can be one of two types, autonomic or somatic, okay? And if you recall, autonomic reflexes are not based on conscious thought, only somatic. Okay, so reflexes that activate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, okay, glands of the body, and regulate body functions such as digest, remember digestion, and rest and digest. Okay, digestion and blood pressure. Okay, now the opposite, as I said before, were the somatic reflexes, and somatic reflexes include all reflexes that stimulate skeletal muscles. And an example of such a reflex is the rapid withdrawal of your foot from a piece of glass, okay, that you may have stepped on. Now, most reflexes have 5 steps. So as I said before, okay, you have the receptor. So here is your hand, okay, and this is where it is. Sensory receptors react to stimuli. They send the information, okay, through or via the sensory neuron to, okay, sensory neuron to the posterior aspect of the dorsal horn or posterior horn. What else? So then that information will go to the integration center. Okay, synapses will occur and a decision will be made. And then the decision, okay, will be sent through the motor neuron, which is the efferent, okay, efferent neuron or nerve, okay, and the motor neuron will conduct the impulses from the integration center at or in the effector organ. So in this case, it will conduct or stimulate a contraction of the bicep brachii. So the effector really is the muscle, the specific muscle or gland that responds to the efferent impulse. Okay, so this is the effector, the bicep brachii. Okay, I've already talked about the meninges, so I'm not going to continue. You do have pictures here, the meninges, dura, arachnoid, and pia. Okay, you can see that it's full of cerebral spinal fluid. And that's it. So your job, your work, okay, yes, I suggest you label these so you know what is what. Your job in the lab manual is to complete exercise 13, questions 4 through 6 on page 160. Also, numbers 8 and 12. Okay, then you are to complete exercise 14, questions 2 through 8. And that's it. So you don't have to do the entire thing, just those questions. And that is pretty much it. I don't think, I'm just trying to see if I have any notes or anything else on it. No, I don't. I do have a picture of the brain, so make sure that you are familiar with this. So 1 is cerebrum, 2 is corpus callosum, okay? 3 is dicephalon, 10 is pineal body or gland, okay? We have 9 is the hypothalamus, followed by 8, which is the pituitary gland, followed by 7, which is the pons, followed by 4, which is the medulla oblongata, 6, the brain stem, okay? Let's see, 5 would be the cerebellum, and 11 is pointing at the branching of the white fibers, so that is your arbovitae, and that's all of them. And so we are done, okay? And that's the end of that, and I just have to post the quiz, and that is the end of this until the exam, which you will have the final exam, and it will be the weekend right before Thanksgiving. So you'll have from Thursday to Tuesday to do the exam. Okay, if any questions, please email me, and I will catch up on my grading.